Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to the Six Bridges Book Festival. My name is John Williams. I'm an attorney at the Public Defender's Office here in town, and I think I should probably disclose, in light of the subject matter of one of our books tonight, a native Alabama. I know we all wish we were in downtown Little Rock, but I'm thrilled all the same to be able to welcome Cep and Toby Muse to talk about two wonderful books. Just a couple of housekeeping items I wanted to talk about before we begin. There will be time at the end of the program or toward the middle even to talk about or have audience questions. So if you have a question, please use the chat function to get those in there, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as I can. I provided links in the chat box to purchase these books, and I hope you'll do so. The link is to Wordsworth Books, independent bookstore here in Little Rock. I encourage you to go there and purchase them. Wordsworth can deliver them right to your door. And speaking of Wordsworth, they are the sponsor for tonight's panel. So I want to thank them for doing that and just for being a great all-around independent bookstore. Now to introduce our authors who are here to discuss what for each of them is a debut book. Cep is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where a review of her author page suggests she has a broad jurisdiction over politics and literature. You should definitely check out her profile of the author Marilyn Robinson in the October 5th issue of The New Yorker. Her book is Furious Hours, which you can see there on her screen, and you can see right here. Came out last year. It tells the story of The Reverend, which is Harper Lee's abandoned nonfiction book about a murderous preacher, his killer, and the trial that followed. And in the process, it tells the very story that Lee never published. Michael Lewis called it the sort of story that even Lee would be proud to write. We also have with us Toby Muse. Toby is a television reporter, a documentary filmmaker, and a foreign correspondent. He has reported from Colombia, Syria, and Iraq for publications like The Guardian, Slate, and Reason. His book, Kilo, tells the story of how cocaine is brought to market and introduces the reader to farmers of the coca plant, assassins and kingpins in the drug war, authorities in the interdiction efforts. It really is a kind of a journey through the life of cocaine and its production and sale. Kirkus Reviews called it an unrelentingly tragic yet indispensable expose of the never-ending war on drugs. And John Lee Anderson, who writes for Casey's publication, was terser. He called it simply kick-ass. So I want to welcome Casey and Toby. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in to see us.
So I think I'd like to start just by asking you to talk a little bit about the origins of these books. What interested you about these topics, and how did you come to write about them? Why don't we start with Toby?
Well, I lived in Colombia. I was a foreign correspondent there for over 15 years. And when you're covering general news in that country, cocaine is often in the background. So the Civil War often revolved around cocaine. And I wanted to write a book that really put the reader at the center of the cocaine war. And I felt over the years that when people had been writing about cocaine, it had become sometimes a bit too academic. We were talking too much in numbers. Oh, the tons captured by the police, or the tons captured by the Coast Guard, or coca crops going up by 15%, trying to cram this underworld of passions into an Excel sheet. And no, these are dark passions that fuel the cocaine underworld. It's murder, it's lust, it's treachery. And I wanted to take the reader and I wanted to put them there, but also introduce the world to this magical, amazing country, which is Colombia, that has had this very tragic history, much of which to do with cocaine, much of which comes from demand from our countries. The cocaine business is fueled by our demand and our policies. So I wanted to show the reader this reality that I didn't think had really been shown from the ground.
I think we'll see when you read and in some of the questions too, that there is a kind of, you're working to portray the human element of that trade.
That's correct, exactly. It was really important to me not to interview experts in this. It was only going to be people on the front line. I wasn't interested in politicians and presidents. It was going to be the people on the front line living and dying for cocaine. So it's interviews with the contract killers, with the police who are walking literally through minefields in southern Colombia, trying to destroy the coca crops. And I wanted to keep it at that level. The human stories, where did these people come from? Who are they? What it's like to be around them. and where are they all going to end up?
Casey, how about you? How did you come to Furious Hours and this really fascinating story and a story within a story?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear Toby talk about his career and about his work abroad and how it led to this book. In my case, I mean, this book takes place in Alabama. I was born and raised in Maryland, so, nowhere near the geographic distance to get to Cartagena or Columbia or any of these places. So I was lucky, already for the New Yorker, I could kind of chase stories that interested me. And I mostly write about literature and religion. And when it comes to literature, I was not the most bookish kid, but I loved books as a kid. And in particular, I loved Mockingbird. I was born and raised in a small town, and that had been a formative novel for me. So I had always wanted to see where Harper Lee was from. And I went down to write about Go Set a Watchman, her second novel that was surprisingly announced in 2015. For decades, she had said she was never going to publish another book. And out of nowhere came this big announcement from her publisher that lo and behold, she would publish a second novel. And right away, there were questions about the provenance of that manuscript and whether she wanted it published and who was overseeing her affairs. Her older sister, who had been her business manager for most of her career, had just passed away. So there were a lot of questions about who was making these decisions and who was profiting from them. So I went down to write about Go Set a Watchman, and I found out about this other project that Harper Lee had worked on in the 70s and in the 80s, and got very interested and liked my time in Alabama. I was mostly in Monroeville then, but this book takes place over in Tallapoosa and Coosa County, closer to the Georgia line. So was eager for the chance to spend more time down there and learn more about her life. And I was lucky because this was going to be her second book. A lot of other reporters who had been interested in this case had not written books about it because they were afraid Harper Lee's book would come out at any time. So I was lucky to find it at exactly the moment where it seemed pretty clear she wouldn't publish her book, and even more so that the story of her life could be part of the story I would tell about that original case.
And so was she still alive when you began the book?
Yeah, she died in 2016. So not long after I started. I was never able to meet her, but she was alive. And there are some people in the book, family members of hers, friends of hers, who really did obey the omerta and would not have talked about her until she died. So there was a shift. A lot more people were willing to cooperate once she passed away, and they felt like they had honored her wishes but could open up about life and some of her struggles. So she was alive for a little bit of the time, but passed away about a year into me working on the book. I would like to think the two are completely independent of one another. She was in her 80s. She had not been in good health. I was not bothering her, and did not lead to her demise, as best I know.
And I think we'll talk a little bit more later, kind of about some of the sources you use and some other people you encountered there. But why don't we do a little reading so people can get a taste of what the books are about. So Toby, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. So this is from the beginning. My book is basically, it follows 1 kilo of cocaine from its production in the mountains and jungles of Colombia, all the way through to its production. It passes through the hands of narco militias, then the cartels, drug traffickers, and then out onto the Pacific Ocean as it races towards the United States and the US Coast Guard. So this is right at the beginning of this process in the jungles. The land of lightning. In the absence of everything, you understand why cocaine. Every step forward we take, another layer of society falls by the wayside. The last hospital, the final supermarket, no more libraries. All, they flow past us as we drive ever toward the jungle. The paved roads come to their end. Now we press on beyond where the roads end. The final military checkpoint. Soldiers with darting glances, worried eyes. The last glimpse of the state, the end of government, the Badlands, cocaine country. All that remains is a motorbike, the dirt track, and a jungle that embraces. I've arrived at the end. I've reached the beginning of the cocaine trade. This is where the kilo of cocaine is born. I roll into the land of lightning with a honey bear under my arm and a storm at my heels. A person of learning would call her a kinkajou, and she's the perfect companion for Colombia's jungles. Agile as a monkey, playful as a puppy. I've carried my kinkajou in her tiny cage through the countryside on a bumpy bus, a boiling truck ride, a canoe trip, wading knee-high flooded tracks and clouds of mosquitoes. Now it's time to set her free. I bought my kinkajou hours earlier from a scumbag animal trafficker in a lawless town. Behind glasses, he leered like a pimp. Sitting at the top of the Fleabag Hotel staircase, he squinted at every guest walking up, asking if they wanted a pet. He kept her in his hotel room, locked in a rusty cage. She hissed and edged away from all who approached her. I decided to buy her and free her in the jungle before he sold her to some family of brutes. He wanted $33. I pushed lower. He dropped to 23, reluctantly. Outside came the long, jarring horn of my bus, warning departure was imminent. After the initial 4-hour bus journey, I sat at a lonely, dusty crossroads, waiting for a truck to take me deeper into the jungle. The truck should have passed by 45 minutes ago. All my kinkajou and I could do was wait. I could feel myself growing attached to the poor thing. She shivered, and with each jolt of the bus, she buried herself in the blanket. They're night creatures, and the harsh sunlight scorched her. The midnight sun was baking our truck, and Manuela rolled on her back and gasped. I had decided to call her Manuela. Succumbing to the heat, I filled her water bowl, but each dwarf-sized pothole heaved the bus and spilt the water. For all the strange looks, Manuela was a good omen. This is Marxist guerrilla country, and they like to leave car bombs along these roads. Sometimes they set up checkpoints to kidnap, burn some vehicles, and kill a few drivers, and split before the army arrives. They say it's for the revolution. Truth is, it's just more madness. Still, could the guerrillas handle this scene? Imagine a guerrilla checkpoint, taking in the sight of a gringo wandering a war zone, carrying a mysterious golden animal in a cage. What good is an AK-47 when you can't wrap your head around the scene in front of you? From the truck, we transferred to a canoe, and I was nearing the end of my journey. I emerged from a canoe in a mosquito-infested river, the cage in my hand, looking like a degenerate gringo animal trafficker, stealing Colombia's nature, wandering the backwaters and selling it back to them at scandalous profits. Many Colombians expect little more from the genus gringo. Now it's time to set her free in the jungle. We rest at the general store next to the river, at the rainforest's edge. The jungle is ominous. I look at Manuela. Light rain tinkles on the plastic roof, and thunder rumbles towards us. I ask for water. They're out, only beer and Gatorade. The storekeeper looks at Manuela kindly. I drink my beer. She must be 6 months old. That's too old for the jungle. The jungle will eat her alive, he says. I look at the wall of jungle at the edge of the clearing. Out there roam leopards, pumas, snakes, caimans, slicing claws and gnashing jaws. She's out of her cage, happily eating another banana and playing with all around her. She is too trusting, too playful, too happy for this world. Hunters probably killed her mother and stole her when she was a baby, he says. I'm surprised by the violence of my emotions for Manuela. Right now, nothing is more important to me than making sure she will live a happy, safe life. She could live for another 20 years. I ask the store owner if he wants a coochie. He nods. With pliers, we cut off the collar the animal trafficker had put on her. Manuela takes to the family immediately, scaling up arms, curling around necks. This family will look after her. It's dusk when I set out again, a kindly gasoline smuggler driving me at breakneck speed on his motorbike along the dirt track. So far, we're outrunning the incoming barrage of lightning strikes. This is Catatumbo, northeastern Colombia, along the border with Venezuela. It's a terrain of jungles, mountains, war, a resilient people, and magic. And guerrillas, cocaine, poverty, and a people abandoned by their government. The first men and women to step through these tremendous mountains, the old indigenous, they understand this land. Hundreds of years ago, they named it Catatumbo, land of lightning, house of thunder. The land is drenched in blood, the indigenous remember, memories of horror handed down through generations, carried in their DNA. The Spanish invasion, genocide, mass rape, slavery, bloody baptisms, entire civilizations destroyed, ancestral dreams snuffed out. Annihilation so complete, entire civilizations were erased, with no survivors left even to mourn them. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, history's greatest atrocity. So grotesque, so obscene, it damned this continent. 500 years later, the curse lives on and dooms these countries to corruption, bloodshed, stagnation. The past is never dead in these lands. The rain comes down harder. A lightning strike juicing me with a 1 billion volt jolt is edging from possibility to probability. We can't stop for shelter. There are appointments to keep. Each lightning bolt illuminates my surroundings. Freezes of massive fields of coca bathed in white electricity. I'm where I need to be. So this sets off the journey. I'm going to where the coca is grown out in this region, Catatumbo, and to meet the coca farmers, those who grow the coca, who begin the first step of this. And that's really the rhythm I wanted for this book in that passage. I wanted to write a book that moves like a bullet, because I feel like the style was appropriate to the subject matter. That I wanted to capture in this book what cocaine is like itself. I wanted it to be thrilling, violent, grimy, glamorous, treacherous, murderous. And I thought the style was important, because if you have that AP style, and it's Pablo Escobar was born in 1949, you're already missing the point. It's like learning about sex from a biology textbook. It's not wrong, but you're missing a lot there. And that's why I wanted to kind of fill in that space.
And so to follow up first, if you have an audiobook, I assume that you're not going to be farming that out. You're going to read it yourself.
No. Actually, we had someone else read it.
Oh, really?
I drift too much to a monotone sometimes. I don't have an explicit one.
But to tell us more about where that goes, and the book does move very quickly in the way you describe. You go from the cocoa fields to the production to sort of the streets where a lot of the trades are made in Colombia. Tell us a little bit more about the direction you go, so that kind of the reader knows where the journey is going, or at least as much as you want them to know.
Exactly. The book is really divided into 3 sections. So there's the countryside where the coca farmers, and it's really a wild town. Like, so if you've seen, well, Americans obviously know that whole culture of the gold rush and a show like Deadwood. Well, that's Colombia in parts of these zones in the coca towns today. There's no law. It's under the sway of narco militias. People will often pay for groceries with coca paste, which is coca leaves turned into some sort of material, a paste. It's one stop short of pure cocaine. And it's this wild town of just social decomposition. You can go to towns and it will have 3,000 people will live there, and there will be 20 brothels. It's that kind of living. There's no law again. Everyone's involved in the business directly or indirectly. So that's the countryside, and that's kind of where the narco militias run and the police. And it's a war zone. I mean, the war on drugs in America and in Europe, well, it's an abstract. The war on poverty, the war on... There in Colombia, we're talking about attack jets, missile strikes, attack helicopters. It's a real war. Then the cocaine moves into the cartel's hands. And these are the urban traffickers. These are the men, mainly men, almost entirely men in the case of Colombia, who oversee the cocaine distribution network. They're in charge of making sure cocaine gets to every corner on this planet. And we're living in a golden age of cocaine. People think it's back with Pablo Escobar. No, there's more cocaine now than ever before. And so that's why this book feels timely. And then the final chapter is that this cocaine is on its way to the United States. So this is where we bring in the semi-subs. These are the semi-submarines that are constructed by cartels, by drug traffickers, to transport 5, 6, 7 tons of cocaine in a single journey. And I'm with the Coast Guard. I spent 2.5 weeks with the Coast Guard as they patrol the Eastern Pacific, possibly the loneliest spot on the planet. And I'm with the Coast Guard as they're trying to stop these kilos of cocaine getting to the United States.
Well, thank you. Casey, would you like to read something from your book?
Yeah, I feel a little bit like, it's so fascinating what other writers are up to and the way they conceptualize their work, because, Toby was writing to be mimetic of the experience of, snorting coke, and I fear a little bit like I was writing the soporific, like, it's slow and deliberative, and, in some ways I really had the opposite instinct, which was to really sit in a place and look around and take it in. And I mean, by total contrast, like Toby deploys this one phrase about, the dams in Colombia, and, by contrast, I won't read this part, but, there's like a couple of pages in my book which are the flooding of the Lake Martin Dam, of that reservoir. It's one of these incredible man-made reservoirs, like the TVA. 40,000 acres of land were flooded, and I do the kind of drip drip of the water rising above the grass blades and the tips of the corn stalks, and just rise. And so yes, it's much slower by contrast. And I think beginnings in general are interesting. Like, I appreciate why Toby felt like he has to take you to where the cocaine really starts. And I think that's always my impulse too. I love beginnings. I love to think about leads. And I think that, we live in an age where actually attention is a real commodity. So I think a lot, especially with the things I write for the magazine, about where to start and how to come in. And so my book, even though it does have that slow, deliberative flooding of the lake and the changing of the Tallapoosa River and the way water moves from eastern Alabama down to the Gulf of Mexico, I knew well enough that I needed to have some kind of a beginning, which would not be that sleepy flooding scene. And which I love Terrence Malick. It's like a Terrence Malick movie, just the way the water rises. So I think that's wonderful. And I think that kind of geological writing is important and really does teach us to look at the world. But I did have enough sense not to really actually start there. So I'm just going to read, it's a shorter passage, but it's the prologue to my book, which kind of introduces you to the main characters such as they are. And I think in a way that's really useful. I like to think visually about writing. And so I think when I first sat down to figure out how the book would begin, I thought about how I wanted you to meet these characters and to think about a moment where they really did intersect with each other's lives. So it's a little bit like a tableau, like you walk into a room and I tell you who's there and I tell you their relationship to one another, but that's how it starts. Nobody recognized her. Harper Lee was well known, but not by sight. And if she hadn't introduced herself, it's unlikely that anyone in the courtroom would have figured out who she was. Hundreds of people were crowded into the gallery, filling the wooden benches that squeaked whenever someone moved, leaning against the back wall if they hadn't arrived in time for a seat. Late September wasn't late enough for the Alabama heat to have died down, and the air conditioning in the courthouse wasn't working. So the women waved fans while the men's suits grew damp under the arms and around their collars. The spectators whispered from time to time, and every so often they laughed, an uneasy laughter that evaporated whenever the judge quieted them. The defendant was black, but the lawyers were white, and so were the judge and the jury. The charge was murder in the first degree. 3 months before, at the funeral of a 16-year-old girl, the man with his legs crossed patiently beside the defense table had pulled a pistol from the inside pocket of his jacket and shot the Reverend Willie Maxwell 3 times in the head. 300 people had seen him do it. Many of them were now at his trial, not to learn why he had killed the Reverend. Everyone in 3 counties knew that, and some were surprised that no one had done it sooner, but to understand the disturbing series of deaths that had come before the one they had all witnessed. One by one, over a period of 7 years, 6 people close to the Reverend had died under circumstances that nearly everyone agreed were suspicious, and some had deemed supernatural. Through all of the resulting investigations, the Reverend was represented by a lawyer named Tom Radney, whose presence in the courtroom that day wouldn't have been remarkable had he not been there to defend the man who killed his former client. A Kennedy liberal in the Wallace South, Radney was used to making headlines, and this time he would make them far beyond the local Alexander City Outlook. Reporters from the Associated Press and other wire services, along with national magazines and newspapers like Newsweek and the New York Times, had flocked to Alexander City to cover what was already being called the tale of the murderous voodoo preacher and the vigilante who shot him. One of the reporters, though, wasn't constrained by a daily deadline. Harper Lee lived in Manhattan, but still spent some of each year in Monroeville, the town where she was born and raised, only 150 miles away from Alex City. 17 years had passed since she had published To Kill a Mockingbird, and 12 since she had helped her friend Truman Capote report the crime story in Kansas that became In Cold Blood. Now, finally, she was ready to try again. One of the state's best trial lawyers was arguing one of the state's strangest cases, and the state's most famous author was there to write about it. She would spend a year in town investigating the case, and many more turning it into prose. The mystery in the courtroom that day was what would become of the man who shot the Reverend Willie Maxwell. But for decades after the verdict, the mystery was what became of Harper Lee's book.
Thank you. So that, I mean, it really captures kind of the 3 parts of the book, and you tell the story of Willie Maxwell, you tell the story of Tom Radney, and you tell Harper Lee's story especially. How did you kind of settle on that structure like Toby's? You have kind of a 3-part structure to your book.
Yeah, I mean, that question is often presented to me in a kind of curious way, but I feel like I'm in good company with Toby. It just strikes me Trinitarian structures work. You know, it means that you're in the kind of mode of storytelling or with that character for about, 80 to 120 pages. And so it feels, long enough that you're invested and you get to know the subject. not so long that, it's burdensome. And for me, I came to this story because of Harper Lee, but the other two characters were just instantly interesting to me. And I mentioned that I studied religion and I write a lot about it. So the Reverend was fascinating to me, both as a Baptist minister and the story of his rural ministry, but also those voodoo rumors and the chance to learn more about some of the other spiritualities in the American South. And, there's no evidence that he was a practitioner of voodoo, but voodoo and root working and these kinds of rural religions, syncretic religions, are very interesting. So I thought it'd be fun to write about that and to contextualize the crimes within the story of his life. And then for the lawyer, it's just it felt obvious to me. I love politics, and every so often you feel tempted to think the past can teach us something about the present. And at that particular moment, which was, in the run up to the 2016 election, I thought the question of what had happened to a liberal like Tom Radney was really interesting. And the way that the two parties had changed. This is kind of the moment where the two parties switch roles on race, and the Dixiecrats are starting to separate from the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party is staking a claim of the Southern strategy. So I like the idea of following Tom. He's extremely famous in this part of Alabama, but unknown around the country. So I thought, someone with that kind of involvement, but newness and unfamiliarity to a national audience would be an interesting way to do it. So it's the Wallace years, and we all have we can populate that part of American history, but here was someone on a smaller scale living through it and finding his way through it. So they were all interesting to me. It felt kind of obvious they deserved their own fair shake. And Harper Lee was the most famous of the three, but by no means the most interesting.
Right, and they definitely got that. You do justice to all three, I believe. I'm starting to get questions from the audience, so keep those coming. We'll get them in a second. I'll ask a few more before we do that. So I'm not sure which is more difficult to get access to, a Colombian drug cartel or the Harper Lee estate. Can you talk a little bit about your sources and sort of difficulties you might have had, and how you got around any problems of access that you needed to write your books? Was it just starting with Toby? I mean, you're working with some people who probably don't want a lot of attention and information being put out about them. How do you get around that problem?
Well, firstly, Casey, that introduction sounds brilliant. Really, it's very evocative. I could see the courtroom, and it's really intriguing. So I can't wait to read the book. Regarding the access, again, it's split into three. So the people in the countryside are actually keen. The farmers are keen to have people there to show their condition because they're so abandoned by their central government. And I'll give you an example, just how abandoned they are. When I was there, they had raised money to build their own school. It took them 3 years. They had put a toll, these farmers, they had put a toll on this dirt track. Everyone who passed by had to pay a tiny amount of money. It could be 20 cents. It took them 3 years to build enough money to build their school. Where was the central government then? And who was able to pay that toll on that dirt track? People who were involved in the cocaine business. That school was not built by the central government. It was built by the cocaine trade. So these people actually invite you in. They'll take you around. They'll say, look, this is how we live. The second part, when you're dealing with, then you then have to negotiate access with these narco militias. Someone who knows them has to say, look, is it okay if this person visits this zone? And they give their blessing or they don't. They've got you monitored completely. And if you just turn up to a narco militia zone without any, unannounced, they're going to assume you're DEA, CIA. So, that's extremely dangerous. So you have to be very open. I'm a journalist and I'm doing this. And that obviously has its own problems because these civilians, you don't want to put them in danger. Moving on to the cartel, that is extraordinarily dangerous because they have no political, it's not extraordinarily dangerous, it's difficult. They have no political agenda. And that's what marks the difference. There's no benefit there. I had made contacts years and years and years ago, and these people on the fringes of that cartel world had become friends. And I had done a number of series of stories over the years, and they could see that I was someone who they could talk to me and someone wouldn't go to prison. So it would start out with a killer for hire. A killer for hire, unfortunately, in Colombia could be the most disposable person in the cartel network. There are people who are killed for $50. So I would do interviews with these people. People would see, no one ended up going to prison. So I earned their trust. And that's the way I was able to rise up through there. But access was difficult. I mean, I should say, this research is basically the result of 15 years of me living and working there. I was drawing on these contacts that I had amassed over all of this time to give that comprehensive view.
So a lot of groundwork. Casey, for you, I gather that the Radneys were a cooperative source. How much did you have to deal with Harper Lee's estate, and what were the difficulties for you in accessing the information you might have needed to write the book?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of these panels are so interesting because, by contrast, poor Toby is, like, I'm sure, carrying a huge life insurance policy on himself, and his mother is terrified for him every day. And, by contrast, Alabama, I'm talking to Arkansas, so you all know, but this part of Alabama where Lake Martin is beautiful, and people were really kind, and even families where sharing family stories is not always a pleasant experience. So, there's the Harper Lee estate, there's the Radney family, but there's also the Maxwell family. And these murders at the heart of my book were, within the same family. So you have people who are related to the Reverend, but also related to someone he's alleged to have killed. So I think that, the three sections were difficult for different reasons. And I guess it's true that, at various points I worried about the litigiousness of any of the three, Harper Lee's estate being demonstrably litigious. And, at that point, when I was working on the book, they had, sued the local museum, pursued litigation against the publisher, sued Aaron Sorkin, sued the Broadway production, had proven their interest in litigation. And so I think at one point I was worried about just access and materials. And then obviously with the publisher, the book was put out by Knopf, so their lawyer was very careful to review fair use. The estate, members of the estate, members of her family were cooperative, but the estate overall did not give permission. So the way a book like mine works is, because it's a journalistic project, you're allowed to quote from letters and unpublished materials, but in a very limited way. So in my case, the reason I ended up searching for like hundreds of letters was because I could only quote a tiny amount of each letter. Without permission or the copyright from the estate, you're very limited in what you can draw on as, a public journalist. So those frictions were there, and along the way they were, more or less pressing. And I don't know, it's very hard for me on this side of things. And I wonder, Toby, it appears that you're in a nice apartment right now. If you can summon the fear you had at various points in those 15 years, I'm sure if you were to ask members of my family, there were days where I was convinced all three families in this book were going to sue me. And, going back through Harper Lee's letters, at various points, she was worried about being sued. At that time, there was a living accomplice. By the time I got interested in the book, no one who was alleged to have helped the Reverend with these murders was still alive. But when Harper Lee was working on it, they were. And in some of her letters, she talks about being afraid for her family and being afraid for herself. So I think from where I sit now, it's very hard to enliven those fears, although they were real along the way. And with regard to the estate, I mean, in some ways, they were more cooperative than I expected them to be. They did return some materials of Harper Lee's that had belonged to the Radney family, but had been in her possession for 40 years. And those were really useful to the book and helped me kind of plot more of her work on this nonfiction project. So I feel really lucky on this side of things. And, I think to some extent, the facts of the estate, are rendered in the final few pages of the book. And I do think there are still a lot of open questions about Harper Lee's affairs, about, who was profiting from some of the decisions at the end of her life and after it. And, I guess sometimes people ask me if I, wanted to say more, and I don't think I'm done writing about that estate, is I guess what I would say. There's a little more, it was not as relevant to the question of the Reverend and her nonfiction manuscript, but, that estate is an interesting body, and the tax bill is still being settled. So some additional publications are likely to come out of it. But, I think it won't be another book, but I'll have more to say at article length probably about her affairs and what happened at the end of her life.
Great, we'll look for that. As a follow-up, after the book was published, and we'll start with Casey, I guess, what sort of reaction did you get from the subjects?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes tell the story. So I was really happy when the book came out. Of course, now we're in coronavirus times and we're all trapped in our homes, and I hope everyone is able to stay safe, and those who are out in the world working, taking the right precautions to do it. But I was lucky the book came out last year, and the whole first week I was in Alabama, And, you know, some of the people who knew Harper Lee or knew the Reverend or knew Tom Radney are in their 80s and 90s and they can't travel. And so I love the first week of events because every one of them was attended by people in the book or people who had given me, you know, family archives or materials like that. And so the event I did in Alex City, Robert Burns, who's the vigilante in the book, so the man I just mentioned who was on trial, was there. One of the Reverend's daughters was there, and about, you know, a dozen of Tom Radney's relatives were there. And I just remember at one moment kind of looking around the room, and it's exactly like that courtroom scene. You could just populate everyone there and the different ways they'd experienced the story. And so I joked for a little while, at least they all left alive, which was not true of earlier meetings of these families and their interactions together. But I think, you know, there was some joy and satisfaction just in the book finally being done. You know, for 40 years, people have been waiting for Harper Lee's version. So the idea that it was a book between two covers you could read was satisfying, even if it wasn't exactly what you wanted said about your family. I think there were some appreciation from all three camps and some dissatisfaction from all three camps, but I think that that's how nonfiction works. You know, if it pleased everyone, it wouldn't be a very good book. It certainly wouldn't be a very truthful book. So I feel lucky that, and then as the events went on, some of Harper Lee's family came to the event in Monroeville. And so, you know, around the country, the different events were interesting for that reason. And I was struck, I did one in Vermont, and at the end of that event, you know, I read kind of like this and took questions. And then in the signing line, this older couple came through the line, and the wife got a piece of paper out of her purse, and it was a letter from Harper Lee. And, you know, that kind of stuff is still like, it's very exciting. It's very fun. No matter how many I've read, it's just, you want to know what's in it. You want to know who she was writing to and when. So I think that was the most satisfying part for me, not so much how people reacted to what was in it, but just how even when you spend years on a story, there's still more to learn about it. And, you know, someone stands up and like they were her college roommate, or, you know, their first boyfriend went to Tuscaloosa with her, and so they knew her at the University of Alabama, but here's a story you've never heard. And it's just always fun to keep learning more about these characters and thinking more about this world.
And Toby, have you heard from anybody you wrote about it? I mean, I can't imagine everybody was satisfied, just as in Casey's case.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people are going to be more unhappy than others, but the most important people are happy, because although the region where I was writing about, that region, Catatumbo, those farmers who took me in there, I haven't been able to get them a copy of the book. The book is not currently available in Spanish. And I don't think anyone in that particular region amongst these farmers, many of them drop out of school at 10 years old. So I don't think any of them would speak English, but I have given interviews to the Colombian press that have been published and kind of hit the points of what the book is. And I have had them reach out to me over social media just to send me a message and saying, hey, you know, it's great that you're giving us a voice, because we do get abandoned, we do get forgotten often. So that was the important one. I know the Coast Guard, I've got good feedback from them. I think the Coast Guard quite rightly thinks most of America doesn't understand what they do. I think that, you know, they haven't received that much coverage in the past 2 decades or something. What's gone from, I would describe as your grandfather's Coast Guard of these men who are, you know, dressed in navy blazers, drinking cups of rum and going out on stormy nights. Well, now they're actually acting as the police of the high seas. And I think there's this change, because most journalists can't afford to lose a report. Most newsrooms can't afford to lose a reporter for 4 weeks to go on these cutters as they patrol the Eastern Pacific. It just doesn't get covered. So they've been appreciative. I haven't heard back from people in the cartels yet. I was going to give Medellin a kind of, you know, I was going to skip the city for a few months anyway, just to see how the reaction. Yeah. Many of the people in this book have actually ended up, this is the natural way of people in that world as well. They've ended up dead. That's just part of the price they all happily accept when they get into that cartel life, that they're going to have a short life and a quick death.
So let's go to the audience questions, and keep them coming if you've got them, but I've got one sort of in that vein for Toby. Audrey Evans asks, how did you measure the risk of your journey against the rewards of publishing the book?
It's always calculated risk. And this just comes down to a gut feeling or what you've heard. And the locals are great. They will tell you, hey, look, you can do this. And actually, Colombians are so overly sensitive sometimes. They want the foreigner to be safe. They'll actually be overly protective. And they'll say, no, 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 you don't want to go down there. And you say, well, actually, no, I need to. And you need to gauge exactly how serious it is when they're saying, please don't go down there. Because again, they would be happy if you just stay in your hotel, and that way they can be sure that you're safe. I mean, there's times there was a drunken party where a narco militiaman got drunk and threatened to, kind of said to his friends loud enough so he knew I could hear, that he was going to kill me. I was in the middle of nowhere at that point. It was 9 o'clock. It was just nothing I could do. All I could do was just kind of edge away from him, let him cool down. And then the next morning we left, because it's time. You know, you hang out in a zone and you do come to the end of your time there. You know, you get to a point where you're just starting to annoy people. They've been patient with you, they've been tolerant, and you're still there. What are you still doing here? So, you know, you just leave at that point. But the cartels is the bad one, because anytime you're around those people, if anything coincidentally bad happens to them, totally unrelated to me, they're going to say, I knew it. He was a snitch. I knew it. And so that's the one where you kind of carry this anchor of dread around your neck. And when I was finished with them and I could just put that behind me, fly out, that was a good feeling.
Are you reporting from Columbia still at all? Are you done reporting from Columbia? Have you moved on to a different reporting spot?
No, I've moved out. Now I'm in the craziness of Washington, D.C. at this point. So, you know, covering this madness, you know, from one crazy story to another.
So I wanted to ask you both a little bit about place and how you convey place in your book and your approach to that. I mean, you're both taking on very, you know, distinct places where I understand you're not natives. How did you go about learning about the place, and how did you approach describing it and portraying it? I think they both come across as very strongly portrayed places. That's for either of y'all.
I guess I'll start. And you know, John, you mentioned where you're from, so you're probably a better judge than I am. Although I will say, some of the most satisfying correspondence I get is from people who are from Alabama, and either they grew up there and they no longer live there, or they've lived there their whole life and go back generations. And I think those notes really matter to me. You know, I'm from a pretty distinctive part of the country with a strong sense of identity, and I know when people write about the Eastern Shore, my hackles go up, and I think critically about what they know and who they talk to and how they position their story. And that felt really important to me about Alabama. I think it is understandably, you know, a state and the deep South, a part of the country that, you know, is much maligned and not always written about respectfully. And it felt really important to me to write a book that, you know, was truthful and honest and forthright, but that also acknowledged some of the beautiful natural landscape and truly the hospitality of the people who live there. And so I was lucky, you know, with the book, something I'm not always able to do when I'm working on an article. I really could just spend a lot of time there. And when you think about getting to know a place, I was joking about, you know, sitting at the Waffle House, but just sitting, you know, for 5 hours one night, who comes in, what do they talk about, you know, talking to your waitress or the cook, and really just settling into a place. And I think being open to the kinds of spontaneous conversations that you're not just instrumentally interviewing people. You're not only asking the kinds of questions about the specific story you're telling, but you're just trying to get a sense of what life there is like. And I love research. And so on top of the kind of contemporaneous explorations, I got a lot of the heritage books, which are these really great local histories, and the WPA files for this part of the country, and looked for as many oral histories as I could find of loggers who worked in fields exactly like the one the Reverend was in, and church histories, and, you know, cemetery histories, and really just trying to read the kinds of ways people who are from there talk about the place. Not only the way outsiders do, not only the way the kind of encyclopedic language works, or, you know, the way the history books write about it, but how do people from there talk about it, and what stories do they tell? And so I really just feel like, you know, sometimes it takes time, and you can't go about it in an efficient way. You know, again, you can't just say, these are the 10 people who know about the story I'm telling, and I'm going to interview them and be done. You know, it takes 100 people totally peripherally to the story to teach you something about the area. And that's what I love about reporting, you know, the opportunity to do that. And just, you know, it's shocking to me we get paid to listen to people and to take down their stories and to think about how to put them in relationship with each other. So I'm really gratified by those notes. And I think that, you know, I try to be that responsible wherever I'm writing about. That profile you mentioned is of a writer who's from the Idaho Panhandle, but has situated much of her life and many of her novels in Iowa, a place I hadn't spent much time. And so I was mindful of it there. But I think especially with Alabama, I knew it was a place like the one where I grew up that sometimes has a chip on its shoulder. And I didn't want to let people down, and I didn't want to give in to the stereotypes that a lot of other writers do. So it was on my mind a lot. And I, again, I'm sure sometimes there are things people, I think I most often disappoint people when I name a specific place and I don't quite get the accent right, but at least descriptive wise it's like right in the book, and the prose is right even if I can't always get the pronunciation right.
Well, to me it rang true, and I recommend it to my Alabama friends, so
there you go.
take that for what it's worth. Toby, you had 15 years in Colombia, so I know you were thinking about the place a lot. How about you?
It's fascinating to see the similarities of what Casey was saying, because Colombians also feel that they've been subject to these unfair stereotypes, that they've had outsiders come in and generalize about them. And Colombians have been this awful stigma of being all drug traffickers. I mean, it's amazing. Even when I was living there, I would go back to London and I would meet friends of friends in a bar, and just there would never miss that idiot who said, "Oh, you're living in Colombia. Did you bring some kilos back?" And I thought, my God, I'm just living there. Imagine being a Colombian and just constantly, every time they meet someone new, there's the possibility someone's going to make some really stupid joke about Pablo Escobar. I mean, and so they suffer with this. So for me, it was so important for Colombians to look at my book and say, yes, he did us well. Because many of them instantly react badly. They don't want to hear more about this. They've lived through this. And that's understandable to some extent, but sometimes it's also utilized and weaponized in bad faith. You can tell there are some people who deliberately want to avoid these discussions about the state of the cocaine industry, about the concentration of political power, of wealth in that country, in order to perpetuate that. So, in fact, the biggest criticisms I would get during my years of reporting were often Colombians who lived in Miami. And that by that state, in the 2000s, when Colombia was very violent and we were reporting this daily massacres, to get an email from a Colombian family, which by its nature really meant that that family had money, to say, why are you misrepresenting my country like this? It would be like, well, have you been to these zones where I'm reporting from? And the answer is no. I don't have to ask that question because very few people can go to those zones. You go to these places in Catatumbo, to go out to where the coca is. That place has been seen by small farmers, soldiers, narco militias, and journalists, and that's it. So I did want to make sure that everybody who I reported on could say, yes, that's an ugly part of my country, but that is true, And I wanted to bring out my admiration and respect for the people of Colombia. These people have undergone just this tremendous, abandonment by the central government that's made them resilient. They're very funny. They can be very generous. They can just be great people to be around. And again, what warms my heart is when people have read the book and just said, man, you really love that country, don't you? And that's the highest compliment I can really receive, that the love for Colombia comes through, even though I'm writing about, it's a dark story.
It is a dark story. And to follow up with a question from one of our audience members, Brenda Allison, she asked whether you feel your book will bring exposure that may lead to change, either in Colombia or within the US.
I mean, I hope so. I mean, that was why I wanted, but one of the reasons for write this book is to have seen so many young men and women cut down in this war on drugs. The Colombian president, Juan Manuel Santos, tried to get a global conversation going when he was in office, which is very rare, to say we need to rethink the war on drugs. No one has bled for this more than Colombia. It's insanity. We keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And I think this is the kind of thing from both sides we should be rethinking the war on drugs. Conservatives should be asking, why are we spending so much money on this with so few results? Others should be look at the civil liberties infringements of it, or what it's doing to these other countries. Look at Central America that has become, just very briefly, but just look what cocaine can end up doing. Much of Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras can become a cocaine transit point. The cocaine leaves Colombia, goes through these countries. Well, that emboldens the local gangs. That makes it more violent. That encourages immigration. That immigration arrives at the border of the US. That can radicalize politics here. You see the knock-on effect all of this has. as long as we have these black markets, we'll have people like El Chapo, Pablo Escobar, and Al Capone. We went through this prohibition once. And again, look, I don't have the answer. My book is not a polemic. I'm advocating for a policy, but I know what we're doing is not working. And when we create these black markets, we let these monsters thrive. And so I hope there will be some rethinking. I really do.
Another audience member asked whether it's safe to go now as a tourist. You depict a fairly bleak part of the country, but what about some other parts?
Please go. It's a fantastic country, and I am writing about a very small, far away parts. You cannot walk out of your hotel, take 2 wrong lefts, and you end up in a coca field. No. In Bogota, Medellin, Cali, if you just follow basic common sense, you're going to have an amazing time. It's a phenomenal country. There's a reason I lived there for more than 15 years. It's beautiful. It just the most pristine natural environment you're going to see. It has its own huge part of the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon River runs through parts of Colombia. There's mountains. The highest coastal mountain range on the planet is there. It has the Caribbean. It's a beautiful country filled with amazing people, just beautiful natural sites. Please go there. You'll have a great time. And again, the parts I'm writing about, you really have to struggle to get to these parts of the country. You cannot end up there by mistake.
So shifting gears a little bit to the subject of titles. Kilo, we know what Kilo refers to. An audience member, Mary Alsop, asked, what does the title of Furious Hours refer to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love my title, and it comes from a public lecture that Harper Lee gave. One of the few times she ever spoke publicly. I think probably if anyone knows anything about her, it's that she was, extremely private, and she withdrew from the press a few years after Mockingbird came out. So really her last full-length interview was 1964. And I hope that Furious Hours kind of complicates the idea that that meant she was reclusive or that she was antisocial, because she was anything but. She just didn't like to talk to the press, and she didn't like to do authorial events. She would never have been on a panel with Toby. She would never have been on a panel with me. She would never have subjected herself to the kinds of questions and scrutiny that most authors really enjoy. It makes writing feel social. But she did make an exception. And a few years after she started working on this true crime project, she agreed to give a lecture in a small town, Eufaula, which is where one of her sisters lived. And it was a favor to her sister. And actually, it was a favor that avoided having Truman Capote come to town, which she knew could be disastrous. He was at the height of his many kinds of addictions and misbehavior. And so, terrified that he would humiliate her sisters, she agreed to give this lecture, which she did. And it was about her favorite historian, and about a historian who, his book is just now back in print, but she had loved it and her family had loved it. And it's Pickett's History of Alabama. And she was talking about Pickett and how he wrote and the book he put together. And what was surprising about Pickett's History of Alabama is that it ended kind of right where most people would say Alabama history got started, at statehood. And Harper Lee had a lot of thoughts about why his book worked the way that it did. And one of the things she said was that he couldn't bear to tell the story of the end of the Creek Empire. So obviously the arrival of colonists and settlers pushed the Creek Indians out, and those Creek Wars ended right near where the Maxwell murders took place. And in fact, the motel where Harper Lee stayed when she was working on her book was called the Horseshoe Bend Motel. And so that lecture has this phrase where she says, the end of the Creek Empire, which came, as we all know, in a few furious hours at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And I love that lecture. And the thing to know about it is Harper Lee, was a few years into her true crime project, was really struggling with it, couldn't find a way to put the book together. And she starts talking about why Pickett couldn't finish his book, which of course he did, he published his, but she says she thinks that Pickett left his heart at Horseshoe Bend. So I love the symmetry of what was happening in her life as a writer and the struggles she was having with what she was talking about in that lecture. So that's, the title comes from that. And I think though, the thing to say is, and I don't know how your subtitle came together, but God bless the people at my publishing house who were like, that's beautiful and meaningful to you, but let's add some, nouns that make sense of it for everyone else. So I like that it refers to kind of all three characters and puts it in the context of her life. But I think probably far more useful is the subtitle, which actually tells you what the book is about, not in a metaphoric way, but in a straightforward murder, fraud, and the last trial of Harper Lee.
So on the topic of frustration, you mentioned Harper Lee's frustration at not finishing the book and her relationship to Pickett. You have a quote in your book, Casey, from Janet Malcolm about the abyss between reporting and writing, and obviously Harper Lee fell into that. Did you ever, either of you ever get stuck in that, and how do you manage if you do?
Do you want to go first, Toby? I fear my answer is really boring.
No, I love your title. Furious Hours is such a phenomenal title. It really is. It's a great choice. In terms of writing, getting stuck, I certainly had this, and I'd be curious to know from you as well, Casey, that this is my first book. And as you had mentioned, this thing about writing leads, and often when I get a lead for a story, the rest of the story will flow. I found, obviously, it wasn't as fluid as this, but once I got one line, I had it. I had the book, and because this is what happens. You write a proposal, you go out, you try to get an agent, you write a proposal, you sell the proposal, you sign these contracts with the publishing house, and then you're like, oh my God, I have to deliver a book. I can't do this. This is madness. How did anyone think I was going to be able to do this? So you go through this, and I think this is kind of common. Everyone goes through it. And it was actually at that party out in the Badlands of Colombia, and I was just about to be threatened with being killed by this drunken narco militia. On my iPhone, I have it still in the notes. I roll into the land of thunder with a honey bear under my arm and a storm at my heels. And when I wrote that line, I said, I can do this. And that was the spirit. I had finally found the voice I wanted to write this book in. There were obviously ups and downs. There are obviously days when you write 1,000 words, you look at them again 15 minutes later and you say, this is awful. And then my advice is, don't even read the books that you think are relevant to the subject. Read the books that you wanted it to be. And those in my work was always going to be the work of Tom Wolfe and Michael Hare's Dispatches. And if I was stuck, I would just open Dispatches, the great Esquire articles about the Vietnam War. It's phenomenal. If you haven't read Dispatches, go read Dispatches. I would just crack that open and I would get the energy, I would get the enthusiasm back, and I could just go back. And that's how I plowed through. Luckily, I didn't really suffer from prolonged writer's block of any sort. So I think I was lucky in this.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Toby. I mean, I just feel like I'm one of the least fussy writers on the planet, and mostly it's easy and fun. And I grew up where people had blue collar jobs, and I've always just felt like I was lucky to get to do this for a living. And I think in some ways I went into this project thinking I had so much in common with Harper Lee, but very quickly I realized she's a very different writer. And I think that, in some ways writer's block can be as boring as paint drying, but I actually think it is one of the most emotionally interesting parts of the book to figure out what made it hard for her and why she couldn't find a way through, and to look at, just the vocation of writing and artistry and what it means. So I think despite having nothing in common with her in that sense, and having never really experienced writer's block, it was surprising to me just how gripping it was. And I think for people who read it, you're really rooting for her, and you wish that she could have found a way through it. And you look at someone like Capote, who had way more dysfunction in his life, but was, incredibly prolific through it. So I think those questions are all really interesting. I do just feel really blessed to not have personal experience with them. It's like the drug trade. Like, I have read about it and, I'm fascinated by it, but can't say I'm a practitioner or, have taken advantage of it. And I feel the same way about writer's block, and just feel very lucky to not have it be among, any of the vices or afflictions I have. So I'm happy to hear you're a happy writer, Toby, and just even typing out the lead on your iPhone. I think there are probably some writers listening who are like, you weren't in a quiet room, with headphones on and the lights off and a, old quill pen in your hand. How could you write under those conditions? Your life was under duress. But, I just think it's a wonderful thing about writing and artistry of all kinds. It takes all kinds.
Well, it's reassuring to know that the words flow easily from both your pens. We're gonna have a hard stop at 8 p.m., but I do want to follow up with one final question on that score. I usually wouldn't ask this, but because there's been so much time between the publication of these books and our panel because of the pandemic, what are you working on now? What can we expect to see from you next, if you're comfortable saying?
I still make documentaries. I just made a documentary about the drug war in Tijuana, another great city, great people. Tijuana was just a revelation. And I'm working on a novel. I want to write a funny novel now. Yeah, I've got the bug for writing books now.
All right, great.
I like it. And yeah, I mean, I'm at work on book 2. It'll take me a while, not as long as it took Harper Lee, but you mentioned that piece in the magazine. It's a profile of Marilyn Robinson, and I'll have another books piece soon out on Faulkner. So probably the
Great.
easiest thing to do is just look for me there.
All right, good. Look forward to both of those. All right, that is all the time we have. I've really enjoyed this. To all our panelists, thank you. Thank you for being here. To the audience, be sure to buy the book. The links are in the chat. And it's been a very good evening with both of you.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Yeah. Take care. Have a great night.
Take care.